Inspector Purbright arrived at East Brackley Parish in the mid-morning, his umbrella neatly folded and tucked under his arm, though the sun shone with unusual cheer. Mrs. Hargreaves, the organist, met him at the door with a polite, almost perfunctory smile, as if welcoming him were part of a ritual she had long since performed for strangers whose visits were neither frequent nor entirely welcome. "Inspector," she said, inclining her head, "I believe I have found something rather untoward behind the organ pipes." Her voice was steady, carefully measured, betraying only the merest tremor of hesitation at the word untoward. Purbright nodded in acknowledgement, noting the exactness of her diction. In a village such as this, every word was a possible clue, every inflection a modest betrayal. He followed her across the nave, observing the pews, the choir stalls, and the rows of polished hymnals, all so orderly that disorder would have seemed almost indecent. The organ loomed at the front, its pipes gleaming under the morning light, each tube reflecting a slightly distorted image of the church interior. Mrs. Hargreaves paused at the edge of the organ loft, her hand resting lightly on the carved wooden railing. "I noticed a slight displacement of the lower panel," she murmured, as if fearing that the word panel might itself be inappropriate for the gravity of the discovery. Purbright examined the area with an eye trained less for drama than for subtle disruption. There it was, a body, carefully concealed behind the pipes, its form undisturbed yet incongruously present, suggesting neither violence nor haste, but a deliberate, almost ritualistic concealment. The inspector's first thought was less about the corpse itself than about the manners of the parishioners who had, by some unspoken agreement, chosen to ignore its presence until now. Who, he wondered, had decided that this particular indignity was better hidden than confronted? The question lingered not unpleasantly, as he noted the meticulous dusting of the organ case and the absence of smudges elsewhere, implying a care taken to preserve appearances. Mrs. Hargreaves stepped back, folding her hands before her, as though in silent apology for the necessity of his attention. It is difficult to imagine how it came to be here," she said, her words hesitant, not for want of vocabulary but for the careful avoidance of implication. Purbright inclined his head, appreciating the social nuance. The discovery of a body was rarely a matter of mere accident in villages that prized reputation above reality. He asked a series of polite questions about the recent activity in the church. Choir rehearsals, committee meetings, the arrival of visitors. Every response was phrased with decorum, yet Purbright detected the faintest tremor of discomfort. Mr. Fenton, the treasurer, had been notably absent that morning. The vicar was otherwise engaged with preparations for a tea intended to impress a visiting clergyman. Mrs. Tilbury, whose attentions to the organ were curiously meticulous, seemed unusually alert to any mention of structural alterations, and even the younger choristers whispered nervously when passing the loft. Every individual's behavior suggested a familiarity with proprieties and an equally familiar discomfort with deviation. The inspector made a discreet note. The body's presence was as much a social perturbation as a physical one. Purbright lingered near the organ bench, examining the floorboards and the surrounding architecture with precise calm. A slight scuff mark caught his attention, a trace of something dragged or displaced, though he could not yet identify its origin. His mind considered the possibilities. Had someone sought to hide the body temporarily, intending its discovery at a later controlled moment? Or was this concealment a permanent solution in the mind of a parishioner determined to avoid scandal at any cost? The act, he realized, could reveal more about human vanity and petty jealousies than any overt confession ever might. Mrs. Hargreaves watched him quietly, her hands folded, betraying neither fear nor guilt, but rather a curious combination of civility and minor pride. Pride that her music, and the organ itself, had inadvertently become the repository of village secrets. During his inspection, Purbright noted a series of small details that would escape a less observant eye. A ledger had been left open on a nearby table, its entries meticulously maintained yet with a conspicuous omission of recent donations. A folded letter, slightly creased at the corner, suggested a hurried removal from a desk drawer, yet its content remained tantalizingly obscure. Even the positioning of hymnals hinted at habitual attention to detail, an almost ritualistic precision designed to reassure parishioners that nothing was amiss. Purbright reflected that in such communities, concealment rarely required violence. Silence and over-politeness often achieved the same effect with greater subtlety. The inspector allowed himself a moment of dry amusement at the thought that the parish, in maintaining appearances, had orchestrated a tableau far more intricate than any criminal act. The vicar returned to the church during the morning service, noting Purbright's presence with formal courtesy. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head, "you have already made your observations, I trust?" His tone was neither defensive nor inquisitive, but maintained a precise equilibrium of civility and mild deference. Purbright responded with understated agreement, noting the subtle frown as the vicar's gaze drifted toward the organ loft. Their exchange revealed the layers of social performance endemic to the village: politeness as a shield, moral propriety as a weapon, and routine as a barrier against confrontation. In the pews, other parishioners shuffled, whispering discreetly, aware of the inspector's presence, yet careful to preserve outward calm. Purbright's trained eye catalogued every glance, every pause, every unspoken judgment. By midday, Purbright had begun to form an initia. Cautious hypothesis. The body had been concealed deliberately to preserve social equilibrium, rather than to hide evidence of wrongdoing. Village reputations were fragile, and any deviation from propriety, real or imagined, required careful management. The minor scuffs, the subtle misplacements, the overly precise attention of Mrs. Tilbury and the ledger's omissions all pointed toward a collective act of concealment, born not of malice, but of anxious morality. He imagined the discussion that might have taken place among the parishioners: polite suggestions, hesitant agreements, a shared acknowledgement that revelation would imperil appearances. The act itself, if discovered, could never be discussed openly, yet its existence shaped the social landscape in profound, silent ways. As afternoon drew near, Purbright requested that Mrs. Hargreaves provide a complete list of those who had had access to the organ loft over the past month. She complied with a careful grace, enumerating choir members, committee representatives, and visitors with meticulous accuracy, while failing, either inadvertently or intentionally, to mention the lodger who had arrived recently. The omission was slight, yet in a village governed by decorum, such a detail could not be dismissed lightly. Purbright noted it in his notebook, aware that minor lapses in protocol often revealed the weightiest truths. Even as the sun cast narrow beams across the nave, illuminating dust motes in stately arcs, the inspector understood that the discovery was less a matter of fact than a mirror reflecting human foibles, petty ambitions, and the ceaseless attention to appearances. By the chapter's end, Purbright paused on the threshold of the organ loft, surveying the assembled ensemble of carefully arranged pipes, polished wood, and the silent, watchful parishioners. He felt, as he often did in these early stages, the quiet satisfaction of uncertainty, a puzzle whose pieces had begun to suggest shape, though the final image remained elusive. A faint, almost imperceptible movement at the edge of his vision, a shuffle of feet, a brief glance toward the organ by Mrs. Tilbury, caught his attention. It was slight, ambiguous, and easily ignored, yet it carried within it the hint of intentionality, a shadow of secret knowledge. Purbright's lips pressed together in his habitual, discreet smile. The mystery had begun, and with it, the slow, elegant unfolding of observation, deduction, and social revelation. Inspector Purbright arrived at the vicarage shortly after the morning post, his expression carefully neutral, as though one might convey either surprise or disapproval without betraying preference. The vicar, a man of deliberate pace and habitual understatement, welcomed him with the same courtesy reserved for visiting dignitaries or rare strangers. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head with measured grace, "these letters arrived earlier today. Perhaps you would care to examine them for any relevance." Purbright accepted the sheaf with the faintest acknowledgement of thanks, noting the careful alignment of envelopes, each bearing the neat, rounded handwriting of parishioners who prized propriety above expedience. Some were brief, formal missives, while others extended into the realm of the gently admonitory, hinting at minor infractions without ever naming names. As he turned the pages, Purbright observed the layers of civility and subtle accusation embedded within. One letter, from a committee member, addressed a trivial ledger discrepancy with words so polite they might have been mistaken for compliments, were it not for the slight emphasis on accuracy and proper attention. Another, composed in the lilting script of a long-standing parishioner, seemed to chastise Mrs. Hargreaves' foe. Minor deviations in her musical schedule, though the phrasing suggested pride in her accomplishments as much as reproach. The inspector's eye, trained for nuance, detected the faint shadow of irritation beneath courteous phrasing, the almost imperceptible tilt of sentences that carried unspoken judgments. Letters, he mused, often betrayed more than confessions, for they allowed civility to mask ambition, resentment, and petty surveillance. He made note of a misdirected letter, addressed to the lodger whose arrival had coincided with the discovery behind the organ. The envelope had been mistakenly delivered to the vicar's table, and its contents, a brief, vaguely apologetic note referencing a temporary arrangement, seemed innocent, yet its timing suggested premeditated obscurity. Purbright set the letter aside, not as evidence, but as a whisper of social strategy, the sort that relied less on concealment than on selective awareness. In villages such as East Brackley, he knew, the quietest transgression was often a question of timing. Who saw what and when mattered far more than the act itself. He considered the lodger's demeanor during his brief meeting the previous day, a calm attentiveness, almost polite curiosity, which now suggested a subtle orchestration of appearances. The inspector turned next to the ledger, left open on the vicar's polished desk. A careful comparison revealed minor anomalies, a misdated entry here, a donation not accounted for there, each trivial in isolation, but cumulatively suggestive of deliberate obfuscation. The vicar, noticing Purbright's focus, offered a faintly self-conscious explanation. The church secretary had recently been indisposed, necessitating temporary delegation of duties to Mr. Fenton. Purbright accepted this with polite acknowledgement, though he mentally catalogued the sequence of explanations against the ledger's inconsi. Stencies. He had long since learned that explanations offered in good faith often served as shields for concealed motives, the manner of delivery as instructive as the content itself. Mrs. Hargreaves entered the room, carrying a tray of tea with immaculate discretion, her movements rehearsed enough to appear effortless, yet precise enough to betray an ingrained consciousness of observation. "Inspector," she said, in a tone carefully balanced between cordiality and apprehension, "I thought perhaps you might wish to see these also." She laid before him several sheets of handwritten notes, diary extracts, rehearsal schedules, and annotations she had made concerning the organ and its occasional unexplained noises. The entries, while seemingly mundane, hinted at the pattern of activity around the loft over the preceding weeks. Faint scuff marks, irregularities in musical notation, and occasional unexplained absences from rehearsals began to form a subtle mosaic. Purbright, with his habitual attention to minutiae, noted that the lodger's name appeared on a single entry, circled with the faintest degree of emphasis. The inspector's mind oscillated between the written record and the oral accounts he had gathered during previous visits. Choir rehearsals, committee meetings, casual social calls, all appeared routine, yet the letters suggested hidden conflicts. One missive subtly critiqued the timing of an unapproved rehearsal, implying negligence rather than malice, yet Purbright understood that the line between the two was a matter of social calculation. Each person's behavior, meticulously observed, offered a reflection of the collective anxiety, a delicate balance of oversight, attention to propriety, and the unspoken fear of exposure. Even a minor deviation, a mislaid pen, a tardy arrival, might become, in the proper sequence, a source of scandal. Purbright considered Mrs. Till Berry, whose attentions to the organ had previously seemed excessive. The letters, he observed, contained indirect references to her meticulous involvement, courteous suggestions that she assist in monitoring the loft, references to her expertise in minor repairs, and polite invitations to oversee certain procedures. Her compliance, always accompanied by careful phrasing and subtle smiles, could mask either the innocence of dutiful service or a more active engagement in the concealment of truth. The inspector, noting the repeated convergence of her presence with the lodgers, began to suspect that these two individuals, in their own discreet ways, shared a knowledge unacknowledged in public. The vicar's interruptions were rare and subtle, usually in the form of questions couched in the softest terms of curiosity. "Inspector, would it be imprudent to examine the choir room?" he asked, not as an instruction but as an invitation to consider the social proprieties inherent in such a move. Purbright responded with understated assent, noting that even this inquiry reflected concern for appearances. Villagers, he reflected, managed their moral reputations with careful attention to nuance, rarely addressing problems directly, yet always conveying disapproval or suspicion with the utmost subtlety. A glance, a hesitation, a precise turn of phrase, all were more informative than any overt confession. By mid-afternoon, Purbright had assembled a network of hints, letters marked by passive critique, a ledger partially obscured by polite pretense, and Mrs. Hargreaves' private notes detailing small anomalies in rehearsal attendance. The convergence of these elements, while insufficient for definitive conclusions, suggested that the hidden body behind the organ was entwined with human vanity, social performance, and the anxieties of reputation rather than with explicit criminality. The inspector's mind lingered on the implications. Who had managed the concealment, and how many had knowingly abetted it in the pursuit of decorum? Even minor acts of attention, motivated by civility, could assume the weight of conspiracy when viewed through the lens of village propriety. As the day waned, Purbright noticed a small, subtle clue, a sheet of musical notation, slightly misaligned on the organ bench, marked with pencil annotations in two distinct handwritings, one set, familiar from Mrs. Hargreaves' careful script, and another, more deliberate yet restrained, could belong only to someone observant and methodical, the lodger perhaps or Mrs. Tilbury. The pencil lines, almost imperceptible, suggested a rehearsal of movement, a tracking of activity, a record kept without overt acknowledgement. Purbright's lips pressed together in quiet approval. Such minor observations, unnoticed by the casual eye, were often more telling than direct testimony. He rose, carefully replacing the letters and notes, and turned toward the window, watching the sun cast long beams across the nave, illuminating the dust motes like a faint constellation of secrets. The inspector recognized with his habitual precision that the day's discoveries had not clarified motives but had sharpened questions: who acted in innocence, and who in quiet complicity. Even the most polite interventions, he reflected dryly, might conceal more than they revealed. A faint knock at the door, unannounced, drew his attention. A parishioner, she murmured, with nothing to say, and yet clearly bearing something in mind. Purbright's gaze lingered on her for a fraction longer than decorum demanded. The subtle dance of observation had begun, and the slow, precise unfolding of reputation, suspicion, and understated revelation continued with impeccable discretion. The following morning, Inspector Purbright attended tea, choir rehearsal under the pretext of evaluating acoustics, a matter he approached with the same measured gravity as any investigation. The church nave, bathed in the soft glow of early light, was meticulously ordered, hymnals aligned with ritual precision, music stands set at exact intervals, and chairs angled with a conscientious regard for symmetry. The choristers entered one by one, their expressions polite yet slightly tense, as though aware that even minor deviation from decorum might invite scrutiny. Purbright noted with quiet amusement that over-politeness often concealed more than it revealed, the subtle tension of small-town morality revealing itself in glances, pauses, and the careful modulation of tone. Miss Blenkinsop, the choir director, presided over the rehearsal with a fastidious attention to detail. Her movements were deliberate, her corrections understated yet pointed. "If we could observe the proper measure, Mr. Redding, the rhythm will improve," she remarked, her voice impeccably neutral but carrying the faintest edge of reproach. Mr. Redding inclined his head, cheeks warming slightly beneath his carefully maintained composure. Purbright's attention, however, lingered on the dynamics of observation, the way choristers shifted their weight when others approached, the polite avoidance of direct eye contact with certain committee members, and the subtle rearrangements of hymnals when they passed under Mrs. Tilbury's watchful gaze. Each movement, though ostensibly routine, bore the faint stamp of social calculation. During a break, Purbright made a point of speaking with the vicar, ostensibly about upcoming services, though his questions were carefully constructed to elicit behavioral cues rather than information. The vicar, in his habitual cadence, offered explanations tempered by civility, never defensive yet curiously evasive in areas relating to committee attendance and organ access. Purbright noted a slight tension in the vicar's shoulders when asked about recent visitors to the loft, a detail too subtle for most, but telling for one attuned to the nuanced grammar of propriety. Nearby, Mrs. Tilbury's hands were folded with meticulous precision. She listened intently to a conversation in which she was not directly involved, her eyes briefly flitting toward the organ, then away, as if her attention alone might influence its secrets. The inspector's scrutiny extended to Mr. Fenton, the treasurer, whose frequent overly polite chuckles punctuated otherwise mundane remarks. Fenton's laughter seemed slightly untimely, and Purbright, who had long observed the mechanics of forced levity, catalogued the moments when discomfort was masked by jocular interjections. A brief misstatement by the vicar regarding a ledger entry prompted Fenton to offer immediate, careful correction. The phrasing was deferential, the delivery precise, Yet the interaction revealed a quiet tension. The careful maintenance of reputation outweighed any genuine concern for accuracy. Purbright observed that the choir, in its perfectly arranged symmetry, seemed to mirror the social order of the parish, outwardly harmonious, yet internally attentive to minor transgressions. When rehearsals resumed, Purbright's attention shifted to the organ loft itself. Mrs. Hargreaves played a familiar hymn with her usual elegance, though her fingers occasionally hesitated over certain keys. The inspector noted these pauses, slight as they were, and wondered if they reflected awareness of recent discoveries rather than mere musical caution. Above, the pipes gleamed in their customary polish, their arrangement unchanged yet strangely intimate in their concealment. Purbright considered the possibility that the hidden body's presence, though physically inert, exerted an influence over the parish's rhythm, a subtle shaping of behavior dictated not by fear, but by conscience and collective anxiety. Even the most precise notes of music seemed to echo the unspoken tension permeating the room. Midway through the session, Purbright engaged with several choristers individually, posing innocuous questions about hymn selection and practice schedules. Their responses were polite, measured, and slightly stilted, as if speech itself were a negotiation of propriety. One young chorister, when asked about rehearsal frequency, offered a hesitant account that suggested awareness of activity behind the organ loft. Purbright registered the careful choice of words, the avoidance of direct references, the reliance on temporal ambiguity, and the soft deflection of attention to others. Each evasion, however slight, reinforced the inspector's growing suspicion that knowledge of the body was not confined to one individual, but dispersed across a network of silent complicity. Miss Blenkinsop's management of the rehearsal revealed further subtleties. When a minor discord arose, she corrected it with a phrase so polite that it might have been mistaken for encouragement. Yet the timing, the tone, and the precise degree of emphasis carried implications beyond mere musical instruction. Purbright observed the chorister's reactions, a fractionally delayed compliance, a glance toward Mrs. Tilbury, a subtle straightening of posture. The inspector's method, cultivated through years of minor social investigations, allowed him to read these behaviors as an intricate choreography of conscience and etiquette. Each participant, while outwardly courteous, was engaged in a delicate negotiation of awareness, concealment, and moral posturing. During the final segment of rehearsal, Purbright examined the placement of hymnals and sheet music with careful discretion. Several items were slightly askew, and one sheet marked with pencil annotations bore handwriting inconsistent with Mrs. Hargreaves' usual script. The discrepancy was minor, almost invisible, yet in a community governed by ritual and propriety, such deviations were often the most informative. Purbright considered the lodger, whose quiet attentiveness to rehearsal had previously seemed unremarkable. The annotations suggested an active observation of routine, a subtle monitoring that might correspond with awareness of hidden events. The inspector catalogued these details mentally, appreciating the understated significance of minutiae in revealing collective anxieties. As the rehearsal concluded, Purbright witnessed an exchange between Mrs. Tilbury and the lodger. The conversation was muted, each phrase carefully neutral, yet the timing of glances, the minuscule adjustments of posture, and the polite deflection of inquiry indicated a shared understanding. Whether their knowledge extended to the concealed body remained uncertain, but their behavior suggested mutual cognizance of some social irregularity. The inspector, in his habitual fashion, refrained from overt confrontation, content to let observation accumulate until a pattern emerged. He noted with quiet approval the manner in which the parishioners maintained outward calm while their internal awareness of deviance subtly influenced their comportment. Purbright left the rehearsal with a faint sense of amusement, tempered by professional curiosity. The parish's reputation, meticulously preserved, had shaped every action, glance, and word exchanged within the nave. He understood, as he often did, that the body behind the organ was less a matter of criminality than of social architecture, a silent catalyst for vigilance, politeness, and controlled tension. Yet a subtle anomaly lingered in his mind: the pencil annotations, the brief exchange between Mrs. Tilbury and the lodger, and the hesitant pauses of choristers who knew more than they admitted. Each detail, innocuous in isolation, hinted at an unspoken network of awareness, a constellation of observation and careful concealment. As he stepped into the mild afternoon sunlight outside the church, Purbright allowed his eyes to drift toward the loft. A shadow moved briefly across the upper platform, a subtle flicker, likely the result of sunlight or dust, yet the inspector's trained perception noted the possibility of deliberate motion. Someone, he reflected, had been observing him as he observed them. The day's rehearsals, while outwardly ordinary, had provided the first tangible signs that knowledge of the concealed presence was quietly shared, and that the unfolding of discovery would require careful navigation of manners, propriety, and reputation. The inspector's lips curved in a discreet smile. The intricate choreography of civility and suspicion had begun, and every measured glance promised further revelations, invisible to all but the most attentive. Inspector Purbright was invited to the vicarage for afternoon tea, a ritual conducted with meticulous attention to civility and the implicit hierarchy of East Brackley society. The vicar, resplendent in subdued morning attire, greeted him with the courteous gravity of a man aware that even minor breaches of protocol could ripple through the parish. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head, "I hope the morning's observations have not been unduly fatiguing." Purbright inclined his own head in acknowledgement, allowing the briefest flicker of amusement to show in his expression. Polite inquiry often disguised the most revealing observations. Tea was served in dainty porcelain cups, the delicate clink of china providing a gentle soundtrack to the unspoken judgments simmering beneath conversation. The initial discussion was perfunctory, touching on matters of the church calendar, upcoming donations and rehearsals. Purbright, noting the restrained gestures of those present, recognized that each statement, however innocuous, was a maneuver in the subtle game of reputation management. Mrs. Tilbury, sitting slightly to one side, interjected occasionally, her phrasing so formal as to conceal almost everything she intended to communicate. She complimented the vicar's recent sermon with exaggerated moderation, her words polite but underlined with a faint sense of appraisal. Mr. Fenton, the treasurer, laughed softly at intervals, the laughter calibrated to avoid offense yet simultaneously project attentiveness and moral superiority. Purbright observed them as a social scientist might watch ants, each minute behavior revealing a delicate balance of aspiration, propriety, and concealed awareness. As the conversation progressed, the subject shifted, delicately, toward recent parish controversies. The discussion of a misallocated donation was conducted with exceptional tact, each participant careful to avoid any direct accusation. Yet the subtext was palpable. Mrs. Hargreaves mentioned, almost apologetically, the recent discrepancies she had noticed in rehearsal attendance, phrasing it as a matter of concern for the choir's musical integrity rather than any personal judgment. The vicar nodded gravely, acknowledging the point while maintaining the decorum of impartiality. Purbright noted the tiny glances exchanged between Mrs. Tilbury and Miss Blenkinsop, subtle yet charged with unspoken implications, as if some delicate understanding had been established and yet required secrecy. Purbright requested to examine the ledger and accompanying correspondence, framing the inquiry as routine oversight rather than investigative scrutiny. The vicar hesitated only briefly, then prodded the documents with carefully maintained composure. A review revealed minor anomalies, a few donations entered late, one misdated, a small circumspect note regarding the lodger, whose presence had been quietly referenced but not elaborated upon in previous discussions. The inconsistencies were trivial, yet the arrangement of entries suggested deliberate attention to the preservation of appearances. Purbright recognized with the dry humor he rarely allowed to surface that the parish's preoccupation with civility had inadvertently orchestrated a record of behavior more revealing than any confession. During the examination, Mrs. Tilbury approached the table with careful civility, ostensibly to adjust a stray napkin, but in doing so subtly altered the alignment of documents. Purbright noted the precision of her movement, the slight tightening of her lips, and the momentary hesitation as her gaze lingered on the ledger. It was a gesture entirely consistent with a person conscious of social responsibility and invested in concealment. Miss Blenkinsop, observing from across the room, made a faint adjustment to the arrangement of hymnals on a sideboard, her attention to order hinting at an anxiety extending beyond music to propriety itself. Each act, though trivial in isolation, compounded the pattern of vigilance, a silent choreography designed to maintain the fragile equilibrium of reputation. The vicar, sensing the inspector's scrutiny, broached the subject of private meetings among the committee. "There have been occasional discussions," he said, measured and careful, regarding repairs, donations, and scheduling. Nothing of note, I assure you, though. One must always preserve the harmony of discourse. Purbright acknowledged the observation without comment, aware that the phrasing itself contained the nuance of both admission and denial. The implication was subtle yet unmistakable. Knowledge of certain irregularities existed, but social constraint prevented its direct acknowledgement. Purbright noted this with professional detachment. In a village governed by civility, confession was less informative than the manner of its evasion. Mrs. Hargreaves, drawing attention to the tea service, offered biscuits in a deliberate display of hospitality, her movements smooth yet slightly exaggerated, as though to distract from the discussion at hand. Purbright allowed the gesture its full narrative weight, recognizing the manner in which minor acts of service in East Brackley were often employed to veil concern, deflect scrutiny, or maintain influence. Even the arrangement of cutlery, the rotation of teaspoons, and the precise pouring of tea became components of an elaborate social code, each action measurable and interpretable for one trained to perceive it. He jotted discreet notes on these subtleties, aware that the hidden truths of a parish were often revealed in minutiae rather than declarations. As conversation returned to parish matters, the inspector detected a subtle tension in Mrs. Tilbury's posture whenever organ repairs were mentioned. Her hands clasped in front of her, fingers interlacing with a precision that seemed almost ritualistic, and her eyes darted briefly toward the loft before returning to polite attention. Purbright, with careful scrutiny, noted the lodger's faintly attentive response, a polite nod, a measured smile, a slight lean forward that suggested deliberate interest rather than casual observation. The convergence of attention between these two individuals implied more than mere coincidence, hinting at a shared knowledge or perhaps a coordinated effort to guide the narrative of propriety. Yet nothing was stated outright. Civility remained unbroken, and every gesture maintained the semblance of decorum. The inspector. The examination of letters and ledger entries continued, revealing a network of minor discrepancies and omissions. Each appeared innocuous, yet in the context of prior events, rehearsal schedules, committee meetings, and casual observations, they suggested a carefully managed concealment. Purbright allowed himself the dry amusement that such social engineering often replaced overt criminality. A body hidden behind organ pipes might provoke scandal, yet it was the management of awareness, attention, and propriety that ensured silence prevailed. The letters, written with polite ambiguity, carried admonitions, inquiries, and subtle corrections, each phrase to avoid overt confrontation while preserving moral authority. By the conclusion of the afternoon, Purbright had amassed a collection of impressions rather than evidence. The parish functioned as a self-regulating organism, each member contributing to the preservation of reputation and the management of knowledge. Small gestures, a glance, a breath, the careful alignment of papers, spoke as loudly as any confession might. He reflected on the subtle shifts in attention between Mrs. Tilbury and the lodger, the adjustments of Miss Blenkinsop to objects in her environment, and the vicar's measured phrasing, realizing that the social architecture surrounding the concealed presence was as intricate as it was invisible. As Purbright rose to take his leave, a slight motion caught his attention. A folded note, previously unnoticed, had been placed at the edge of the ledger. Its presence was almost imperceptible, as though intended to attract only the most attentive observer. The inspector's lips curved ever so slightly in acknowledgement. The village's silent choreography had just revealed its first tangible irregularity. One subtle gesture, one overlooked paper, suggested that while civility and reputation governed behavior, small cracks permitted observation to yield secrets. Purbright stepped toward the door with quiet deliberation, noting that the day's revelations were not final, but had opened a space for inquiry, a gentle shift in the undercurrent of suspicion that would guide the next stage of his investigation. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish hall in the late morning, a notebook tucked neatly under his arm, and a demeanor that suggested casual civility rather than overt scrutiny. The committee members were already gathered, each assuming a posture of attentive decorum, the air thick with the unspoken necessity of politeness. Mr. Fenton, the treasurer, offered the customary greeting, his smile carefully measured and perhaps a fraction too bright, while Miss Blenkinsop, perpetually exacting, adjusted the angle of her chair with the slightest, almost imperceptible precision. Purbright noted the subtle choreography of propriety, each movement calibrated to avoid offense, yet simultaneously to signal attentiveness, an unspoken negotiation of social capital. Even the placement of cups and papers seemed purposeful, designed to display civility while concealing individual discomfort. The meeting commenced with routine matters, fund allocation, upcoming services, and minor structural repairs, yet beneath the surface, every word and gesture carried latent significance. Purbright observed that disagreements were couched in extreme courtesy. Mr. Fenton's corrections to ledger entries were delivered with polite deferential phrasing, while Miss Blenkinsop's suggestions for choir scheduling were framed as advisories, avoiding any direct challenge. A subtle tension underlay the discussion of the organ loft, whose recent inspection had already provoked mild unease. The inspector noted that glances toward the organ were brief, calculated, and almost entirely indirect, suggesting awareness of prior eye. Regularities. Civility served both as shield and as measure of compliance, revealing more through omission than declaration. The discussion turned, delicately, toward recent donations. Mr. Fenton recited figures with meticulous care, emphasizing punctuality and procedural propriety, yet Purbright detected an irregular rhythm in his tone, a brief hesitation when mentioning contributions coinciding with the lodger's arrival. The treasurer's light laughter, a habitual balm against social discomfort, seemed slightly misaligned, as though it concealed an internal correction or awareness. Miss Blenkinsop offered the occasional annotation, politely deflecting attention from specific names and dates, though the very act of deflection spoke volumes. Purbright allowed himself a dry smile. The outward calm of the committee masked a network of attentiveness, small anxieties, and self-regulation. Reputation, he reflected, was a form of currency here, as exacting and as fragile as any balance sheet. Mrs. Tilbury, seated toward the rear, exhibited a peculiar combination of hyper-attentiveness and polite detachment. Her hands rested neatly on her lap, yet her eyes tracked movements across the table with meticulous interest. Purbright observed that she leaned slightly forward when the organ was mentioned, and then relaxed just enough to maintain appearances. A brief whisper to Mr. Fenton, disguised as a query about hymnals, elicited a subtle nod, and the inspector recorded the interaction, a minor, almost imperceptible exchange, yet one that implied shared understanding or prior coordination. The social undercurrent of the meeting, more than any spoken words, revealed a lattice of observation, tacit complicity, and careful concealment. Purbright's attention returned to the ledger, left open for public perusal, and he noted several discrepancies: a donation misstated, a minor omission, and a brief note regarding the lodger. Each anomaly was trivial in isolation, yet collectively they suggested deliberate oversight rather than error. The inspector mused on the village's habitual use of civility to manage embarrassment. A ledger could obscure as much as it recorded, and polite phrasing could shield missteps while appearing entirely transparent. Mrs. Hargreaves, present ostensibly to offer clarification on musical scheduling, interjected with a question so carefully phrased it suggested inquiry without accusation. The effect was subtle yet disarming, revealing attentiveness without confrontation. A minor disagreement arose concerning seating for an upcoming service. Mr. Fenton proposed an adjustment of pew assignments to accommodate recent donors, phrased with all the decorum of a suggestion rather than a directive. Miss Blenkinsop's response was measured, acknowledging the rationale while quietly reaffirming traditional arrangements. The negotiation was polite, indirect, and socially charged. Every word served a dual purpose: the resolution of a practical matter and the preservation of appearances. Purbright observed the minute shifts of posture, the barely perceptible furrowing of brows, and the careful realignment of documents, each indicative of underlying concern. Even minor social infractions were treated as potential threats to equilibrium. As the meeting continued, Purbright noted the lodger's absence, conspicuous only to those trained to observe social patterns. While some might regard him as a neutral observer, the inspector speculated that his presence elsewhere could be as deliberate as any action taken at the hall. Villagers, he reflected, often exercised influence without overt participation. The mere anticipation of observation could guide behavior as effectively as any direct instruction. This invisible oversight, coupled with the committee, this meticulous management of civility, created a delicate lattice of suspicion, anxiety, and moral self-regulation. Purbright's mind catalogued interactions: Mrs. Tilbury's minute attentiveness, Miss Blenkinsop's strategic phrasing, and Mr. Fenton's lightly veiled self-consciousness. Each was individually unremarkable, yet together they suggested a network of subtle coordination. The inspector recognized the familiar pattern. When reputations are fragile, the community enforces its own morality, and the smallest gestures, glances, pauses, realignment of papers, become signals in a silent, intricate dialogue. He noted a particularly deliberate glance from Mrs. Tilbury toward the organ loft, accompanied by a barely discernible tightening of her lips, and recorded it in his notebook. The meeting adjourned with customary civility, the members rising with formal precision, adjusting chairs, and exchanging measured smiles. Yet Purbright detected a quiet fissure in the facade. Miss Blenkinsop lingered momentarily by the hymnals, adjusting a misaligned sheet, her movements deliberate yet slightly tense. Mr. Fenton's laughter, too soft to fill the hall, seemed slightly forced, as though he had become conscious of some unacknowledged discrepancy. The inspector reflected on the subtle interplay of attention and concealment, the delicate negotiation of perception, and the unspoken hierarchy that governed both behavior and knowledge. Even the act of leaving the hall adhered to invisible codes of propriety. Outside, the late morning sun illuminated the parish yard, revealing nothing of the internal tension except through the measured gait and posture of departing committee members. Purbright allowed himself the dry amusement of recognizing that the day's session, outwardly ordinary, had subtly shifted the distribution of awareness. Minor anomalies, carefully observed, hinted at prior company, ordination and discreet knowledge of events surrounding the organ loft. As he closed his notebook, the inspector's attention was drawn to a faint smudge on the bottom edge of a ledger page, a mark so slight it could easily be dismissed, yet, in context, suggested recent handling by an unseen hand. Purbright lingered in the yard, noting that the shadow of the church stretched long and narrow, as if mirroring the latent structure of social vigilance within. He observed Mrs. Tilbury exchanging a discreet glance with the lodger, their expressions impeccably neutral, yet suffused with subtle acknowledgement. The inspector, always attentive to the grammar of civility, understood that this minor interaction might contain as much meaning as any overt statement. One minor mark, one brief glance, one measured smile, all could constitute the architecture of hidden knowledge. Purbright inclined his head slightly, allowing the village's quiet choreography to unfold before him. A soft draft rustled a nearby leaflet, and Purbright bent to examine it. On its margin, almost imperceptible, were two faint pencil lines forming a small, deliberate notation. It seemed minor, inconsequential, yet the inspector understood that even the smallest adjustment could signal awareness, intention, or complicity. The committee, it appeared, had not acted in isolation. Someone, somewhere, was subtly coordinating observation, preserving appearances, and ensuring discretion. The chapter closed with Purbright noting the mark with quiet satisfaction, aware that this seemingly trivial clue would guide his next inquiry, revealing, in time, the delicate lattice of knowledge, suspicion, and moral economy that defined East Brackley's careful society. Inspector Purbright arrived at the vicarage mid-morning, summoned by Mrs. Hargreaves' suggestion that her diaries might illuminate patterns of activity around the org and loft. The vicar, in his habitual slow cadence, welcomed him with civility tempered by discreet curiosity. "Inspector," he said, inclining his head, "these records are hardly formal evidence, yet they may prove instructive." Purbright acknowledged the comment with a subtle nod, aware that in East Brackley, distinctions between evidence, conjecture, and polite suggestion were often less categorical than one might hope. Mrs. Hargreaves produced the diaries with immaculate care, their covers polished, corners squared, and bindings preserved as if they had already been judged for propriety. The inspector seated himself at the vicarage table and began to examine the entries. The diaries were composed with meticulous precision, detailing rehearsal schedules, committee meetings, visitors to the loft, and the faint irregularities that had punctuated the otherwise uniform rhythm of parish life. Each notation, while ostensibly banal, revealed subtle concerns, a repeated mention of a minor misalignment in the organ pipes, a record of an unexplained absence, and occasional references to a silent observer whose identity was never specified. Purbright's attention, trained to detect significance in restraint, found the entries suggestive of deliberate concealment. The minutiae of movement, phrased in polite language, documented the rhythm of unacknowledged oversight. Mrs. Hargreaves, seated nearby, occasionally offered clarifications in carefully measured tones. "The lodger," she said at one point, "was observed in the loft, but I assumed it was a harmless curiosity." Her phrasing was precise, neither defensive nor confessional, merely noting a fact couched in civility. Purbright considered the implications. The lodger's presence, previously regarded as neutral, now appeared within a continuum of careful monitoring, a pattern of minor surveillance consistent with deliberate OBS. Ovation. Even the phrasing of omission, he reflected, could reveal as much as explicit acknowledgement, particularly when crafted with the composure and decorum characteristic of East Brackley parishioners. The diaries revealed minor anomalies in rehearsal attendance. One entry, for example, noted that Mr. Redding had arrived late for practice, yet failed to provide explanation beyond a vague reference to necessary errands. Another, more curious, recorded that Mrs. Tilbury had lingered near the organ loft during moments of supposed inactivity, observing without participation, her presence framed as mere conscientiousness. Purbright noted the convergence of these details, timing, repeated patterns, and the interplay of observation and discretion suggested a subtle coordination among parishioners, an implicit choreography of oversight intended to preserve decorum. The diary entries, mundane in isolation, coalesced into a pattern of latent awareness. Purbright's attention turned to a particular series of annotations in the margins, tiny pencil markings denoting discrepancies in rehearsal schedules. Some were circled, some underlined, and a few accompanied by the initials MB, likely Miss Blenkinsop. The markings were almost invisible, yet their deliberate precision indicated attention beyond casual observation. The inspector considered the implications. These notes could reveal anticipation of visits to the loft, an awareness of movements in and around the organ, or perhaps a methodical record of minor irregularities. In East Brackley, he reflected dryly, a notebook could be a more formidable instrument of accountability than a ledger or formal complaint. As the morning progressed, Purbright observed Mrs. Hargreaves' careful attention to social propriety, even within her private environment. She poured tea with meticulous ceremony, ensuring the cups were aligned with geometric precision and offering biscuits with a degree of restraint that emphasized decorum over indulgence. Even such seemingly trivial gestures were not lost on Purbright, for in villages where moral hierarchy was scrupulously maintained, attention to ritual often revealed social cognition, awareness of observation, desire to preserve reputation, and subtle signaling of propriety. The act of serving tea, he noted, became a minor instrument of social discipline, an understated but effective conduit of influence. The inspector's scrutiny extended beyond the diaries themselves to the interpersonal subtleties of the vicarage. Miss Blenkinsop arrived unexpectedly, ostensibly to retrieve sheet music, yet her precise movements suggested attention to peripheral observation. She adjusted a slightly misaligned chair, then paused to glance toward the loft with a manner so controlled it was almost imperceptible. Purbright catalogued this behavior, a careful performance of neutrality masking curiosity, a habitual vigilance shaped by a community's pervasive attention to propriety. The lodger, silently observing from a distance, exhibited similar habits of measured attention, indicating either deliberate study or participation in the unspoken monitoring that governed the organ loft. The diaries contained references to whispered conversations at committee meetings, framed as inquiries into procedural correctness rather than social observation. One entry noted a brief disagreement about the allocation of funds for organ repairs, phrased delicately to preserve the dignity of all involved. Purbright detected a faint trace of moral anxiety beneath the surface civility. The concern was less about musical performance than about preserving appearances. Even minor disputes, he observed, became vessels for latent social commentary, each annotation recording not only facts, but the subtle shores of moral conformity and reputational preservation. By early afternoon, Purbright's analysis suggested a convergence of observation, awareness, and coordination. Minor discrepancies in schedules, annotations in diaries, and fleeting glances exchanged between Mrs. Tilbury and the lodger hinted at shared knowledge of events surrounding the organ loft. The inspector considered the implications with his habitual dry amusement. A body, though physically concealed, exerted influence over the parish through the architecture of attention, propriety, and social control. The diaries, in their combination of minutiae and restraint, provided a map of observation more precise than any oral testimony could achieve. Purbright allowed himself a brief reflection on the village's moral economy. Knowledge of a transgression, real or imagined, was often more potent than the act itself. Each participant in the parish, through the careful management of awareness, maintained equilibrium while safeguarding reputation. He noted a subtle tremor in Mrs. Hargreaves' otherwise meticulous hand as she turned the page, a hesitation that might indicate recollection, concern, or merely the burden of responsibility. Similarly, Miss Blenkinsop's faint tightening of her lips suggested discreet recognition of oversight or complicity. These minor gestures, Purbright recognized, constituted the social fabric of East Brackley. As the inspector prepared to depart, a small piece of folded paper slipped from the back cover of a diary. He retrieved it with deliberate calm, noting that the handwriting was neither Mrs. Hargreaves nor Miss Blenkinsop's. The brief notation contained a cryptic reference to a date and a set of initials, suggesting an observation or event previously undocumented. Purbright's lips curved in understated approval, a seemingly trivial clue, almost invisible, yet pregnant with signify. The chapter closed with the inspector regarding Mrs. Tilbury's deliberate but unremarkable gaze toward the loft, and the faintest suggestion of recognition in the lodger's posture. The lattice of observation, concealment, and propriety had grown more intricate, and one small mark now promised a delicate unraveling of otherwise perfect civility. Inspector Purbright arrived at the parish library mid-morning, ostensibly to examine records of donations and meeting minutes that had been stored there. The library, a narrow room lined with oak shelves and the faint scent of polish and paper, exuded an air of disciplined restraint. Mrs. Tilbury, already present, moved with the precise economy of gesture familiar to Purbright, hands folded in front, gaze scanning the room as though each volume contained not only history but moral instruction. She inclined her head politely, and the inspector returned the gesture with measured neutrality, fully aware that in East Brackley civility was both a mask and a means of surveillance. Purbright seated himself at a polished table and began reviewing the committee minutes. Each entry, though outwardly mundane, approvals of repairs, scheduling of events, notes on minor donations, contained traces of understated judgment. Certain phrasing drew attention. It is suggested that care be taken, or with due respect to custom, each a veiled admonition in the language of politeness. The inspector noted how these carefully chosen words reflected an intricate system of social policing, maintaining moral equilibrium while avoiding direct confrontation. Mrs. Tilbury observed quietly, offering no commentary, though the slight tightening of her lips betrayed the faintest tension, as if each word were a subtle challenge to her own oversight. Purbright's scrutiny extended to the annotations in the margins, delicate pencil marks noting inconsistencies or queries about attendance and donations. One entry referenced an unrecorded visit to the organ loft, a detail unremarkable in isolation, yet the combination of timing, initials, and context suggested deliberate concealment. The inspector catalogued the margin's small deviations with professional patience, noting that every minor addition hinted at private observation. Someone had been watching, recording, and maintaining control over appearances without overt acknowledgement. Even casual references to the lodger's presence were framed in language designed to suggest curiosity rather than scrutiny. As he continued, a faint rustle indicated movement nearby. Miss Blenkinsop had arrived, ostensibly to consult a hymn compilation. Her footsteps were measured, her gaze precise, and she aligned herself with meticulous attention to the table's edge before speaking. "Inspector," she said, her tone formal and entirely neutral, "the records here may not be complete, though I have endeavored to note all relevant activities." Purbright inclined his head, registering not only the content but the form. The phraseology suggested thoroughness and propriety, yet carried a hint of understated concern regarding possible omissions. Miss Blenkinsop's brief glance toward Mrs. Tilbury and the loft was almost imperceptible, yet it conveyed awareness, coordination, and shared discretion. The inspector examined the ledger and cross-referenced it with the committee minutes. A few donations were misstated, and minor discrepancies were noted between recorded attendance and annotated observations. Such irregularities, while trivial in isolation, indicated subtle oversight. Purbright reflected dryly that in villages like East Brackley, errors were rarely accidental, civility and reputation were maintained at all costs, and even minor deviations were carefully managed to prevent scandal. Mrs. Tilbury's watchful presence, Miss Blenkinsop's annotations, and the lodger's unobtrusive attention together suggested a quiet system of moral enforcement, a lattice of vigilance carefully calibrated to preserve social order. Mrs. Hargreaves entered carrying a small tray of refreshments, placing tea and biscuits, with precise consideration for spacing, alignment, and access. Purbright observed the ceremony of service, noting how even these gestures functioned as subtle social control. Each placement reflected awareness of propriety, hierarchy, and expectation. The inspector allowed a faint, wry appreciation for the way human ritual, tea, seating, alignment, could exert influence as effectively as any formal admonition. Mrs. Hargreaves, though outwardly deferential, exhibited a faint awareness of observation. Her movements were almost imperceptibly measured, as if conscious that they might themselves be noted in the diaries or margins of attentive minds. Conversation turned to the lodger's recent arrival. Purbright's questions were phrased with care, aiming to elicit detail without suggesting distrust. Responses were similarly measured, emphasizing observation and propriety rather than emotion. Miss Blenkinsop noted the lodger's presence during rehearsals, framing it as courteous oversight rather than deliberate scrutiny. Mrs. Tilbury acknowledged minor anomalies in his schedule, carefully avoiding explicit commentary while implying tacit awareness. Purbright observed that the lodger, in his quiet attentiveness, mirrored the parishioner's own vigilance, blending observation with unobtrusive participation, a social equilibrium delicately maintained. The inspector reviewed a series of handwritten notes documenting minor repairs and scheduling adjustments. One note, in a faint hand unlike any previously observed, suggested a minor adjustment to the organ loft's lower panels. Purbright considered the notation's implications. Someone, previously unrecorded in committee interactions, had taken interest in structural minutiae, an act of observation intended neither for oversight nor for immediate disclosure. He catalogued this in his notebook, recognizing that small, nearly invisible gestures often revealed more than any overt admission could. In a community governed by civility, the unseen hand frequently dictated behavior with subtlety. Miss Blenkinsop departed shortly thereafter, leaving Purbright to consider the diaries, minutes, and annotations collectively. Patterns emerged: repeated glances, careful alignment of objects, annotations in margins, subtle shifts in phrasing, all indicative of a social system wherein observation, propriety, and reputation were intertwined. Even minor gestures, a tilt of the head, the briefest pause before responding, the alignment of documents, formed a network of vigilance governing behavior around the organ loft. Purbright reflected dryly that moral authority in East Brackley was often enforced not by confrontation but by invisible attention. As he rose to leave, a folded slip of paper slipped from a diary's inner binding. It was marked with initials unfamiliar to him and contained a brief note, a date, and a reference to the loft. The handwriting was deliberate, cautious, and remarkably small, suggesting intention and concealment. Purbright's eyes followed the faint glances of Mrs. Tilbury toward the loft, and he noted the lodger's subtle, controlled posture. The network of observation, previously inferred through behavior and annotation, had revealed a tangible clue, a minor artifact of vigilance that promised further insight. With understated approval, the inspector pocketed the slip, recognizing that even the smallest, seemingly innocuous evidence could illuminate the delicate lattice of awareness, propriety, and silent complicity within the parish. Inspector Purbright returned to the church in the late morning, ostensibly to inspect the organ loft for structural concerns, though his true purpose remained the delicate observation of social dynamics. The nave was bathed in soft light filtering through stained glass, illuminating the pews and polished wood in a manner that seemed to highlight both order and the slightest irregularity. Mrs. Tilbury was already present, her hands folded with habitual precision, eyes sweeping the room with discreet attentiveness. She inclined her head palatal,